It's been a while since I've talked to you, so I have kind of a lot of questions because
You
you're
bet.
up to speed on all this Guthrie stuff. The first thing I wanted to ask you about, though, there's this new interview with the sheriff with People Magazine, and there are a couple things that stood out to me. I'm curious your take on. First of all, Sheriff Nano said that he is no longer directly communicating with the Guthrie family and says those conversations are now being handled by the FBI. And then he said, quote, "The public is frustrated, even the Guthrie family." He's technically still in charge of the investigation. I mean, technically his office is still in charge. And what do you make of the fact that he's not communicating with the family anymore?
Yeah, until it becomes until there's a federal predicate, or a nexus, and the FBI, for example, if she was kidnapped and we knew she was taken across state lines, that makes it a federal investigation. In my experience, and Brian, this is going on over 40 years, it's unusual for the originating agency, the investigative agency who has originating authority, which the sheriff does, not to be in communication with the victim's family. I mean, it would be hard to figure out, well, why, how come? The record, there's enough out there on the record, as they say, there's enough in the interviews. You can see stuff to where it's kind of like, this may be in an advanced stage. Maybe there's something going on we don't know about, which clearly falls within the FBI's swim lane. This is what we do. We do this really well. I have no idea what it is, but let's say it's an advanced hostage negotiation or an advanced negotiation. That's clearly something. But to not have any contact is something that I think that's a question that ought to be answered. The question is, you say you don't have contact. The question is why?
Right. Yeah. I've wondered, and I obviously tried with my coverage, try to be really respectful to the family and think about what
Yep.
they're going through.
104 days. That is how long a family has been waiting for answers. That is how long investigators have been sifting through thousands of hours of surveillance footage, running DNA through labs, and holding press briefings that seem to raise more questions than they resolve. 104 days since Nancy Guthrie walked out of her life in Tucson, Arizona, and simply never came back. And the silence surrounding this case is getting louder by the day. If you are new here, welcome to the Crime Whisper, where we go beyond the headlines and dig into what the official statements are not telling you. If this kind of in-depth investigative storytelling is what you're looking for, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps this work reach the people who need to hear it. Now let us get into it. Nancy Guthrie is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognized anchors in American broadcast news and a longtime co-host of NBC's Today Show. That connection alone guaranteed that when Nancy disappeared from her home in Tucson, Arizona, the story would not stay local for long. But what has unfolded in the months since her disappearance goes far beyond the tragedy of a missing woman. It has become a story about institutional friction, investigative controversy, and a family quietly navigating a nightmare while the public watches and waits. Pima County, where Tucson sits, falls under the jurisdiction of the Pima County Sheriff's Office. From the moment Nancy's disappearance was reported, Sheriff Chris Nanos and his office took the lead on the investigation. In the early days, aerial search operations were launched. A plane went up over the area. Search and rescue teams moved across the ground. And then they found something that changed everything. Blood. The presence of blood at the scene caused investigators to pivot immediately. What had begun as a missing person situation was reclassified. This was not a case of a woman who had wandered off or become confused somewhere. The evidence suggested something darker had happened, and the investigation shifted into criminal territory from that point forward. Now, more than 3 months later, the Pima County Sheriff's Office is still technically in charge of the case. It was never formally handed over to the FBI. But the latest statements from Sheriff Nanos himself are painting a picture that raises serious questions about where this investigation actually stands, who is really driving it, and whether the people closest to Nancy are getting the answers they deserve. In a recent interview with People magazine, Sheriff Nanos made several statements that stopped investigators, journalists, and concerned members of the public in their tracks. The first was this: he is no longer directly communicating with the Guthrie family. According to the sheriff himself, those conversations are now being handled by the FBI. Let that sit for a moment. The sheriff of Pima County, the man whose office is officially and legally in charge of finding Nancy Guthrie, has stepped back from communicating directly with her family. He is technically the lead on this investigation. His office holds originating authority. And yet the family of the missing woman is now being communicated with exclusively by a federal agency that was never formally given control of the case. That is not a minor procedural shift. In law enforcement, keeping the victim's family informed and maintaining direct contact with them is considered essential to any serious investigation. It builds trust. It ensures that family members, who often hold critical background knowledge about the victim's routines, relationships, and recent behavior, remain engaged and cooperative. For the originating agency to step away from that communication entirely is, at minimum, highly unusual. Sheriff Nanos did not stop there. He went on to publicly acknowledge something the Guthrie family had not said outright, at least not in any public forum. He said, and these are his words, that the public is frustrated, and then he added, even the Guthrie family. That acknowledgement carries enormous weight. The Guthrie family has maintained a measured public presence throughout this ordeal. Savannah Guthrie has continued her professional responsibilities while privately enduring what any person would recognize as an unimaginable situation. The family has not publicly attacked the investigation or issued statements of condemnation. But the sheriff himself is now confirming that frustration exists within that family. Given everything that has unfolded in this case, that frustration is not difficult to understand. More than 100 days have passed. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. There is no confirmed suspect. There are no publicly confirmed solid leads. And the investigation, according to the sheriff's own words, is hinging almost entirely on one thing: DNA. Investigators recovered unknown DNA from the scene. The contributor of that DNA has not been identified. Among the biological evidence collected was a rootless hair strand, and the lab is currently attempting to use a method called investigative genetic genealogy to work toward an identification. This technique involves building broader family trees from partial DNA profiles in order to narrow down who the contributor might be. It is painstaking, time-consuming work, and it is not guaranteed to produce results. Sheriff Nanos told People magazine that he believes investigators are getting closer to identifying who contributed that DNA. That is the optimistic read. But in the same interview, he drew a line that had never been spoken publicly before. He said that when the labs tell them there is nothing more they can do, that would mean the investigation has a problem. That would mean, in his words, a cold case. It was the first time the sheriff had publicly used that phrase in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. And the fact that he felt the need to define the threshold for a cold case, even while saying the labs have not reached that point yet, tells you something about where this investigation is and where it could be heading if the DNA evidence does not deliver answers. While the forensic work continues, investigators have also been working through an enormous catalog of digital evidence. Thousands of videos pulled from traffic intersection cameras, Ring doorbells, home security systems, and business surveillance cameras across Tucson have been collected and are being organized. The sheriff described a process of sorting vehicles by type and color so that once a suspect is identified, investigators can rapidly cross-reference that person's vehicle against the footage already in hand. It is a methodical approach, but it is also a reactive one. The footage only becomes useful once there is someone to look for. And right now, there is no confirmed suspect. This brings us to the early moments of this investigation, moments that have cast a long shadow over everything that has followed. Twice during the course of this case, investigators moved on leads that ultimately went nowhere. Once in Rio Rico, and once closer to a location connected to the investigation, federal search warrants were executed and individuals were taken into custody. In both instances, those detainments did not produce results tied to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. The leads dissolved. The federal search warrant from one of those operations has never been publicly released, leaving open the question of what evidence existed to justify it and why it led nowhere. Sheriff Nanos addressed the concern about premature action in his People magazine interview, saying that nobody wants to falsely accuse someone and that a fair investigation is what guarantees a fair trial someday. That is a sound legal principle. But the two failed detainments are part of the public record now, and they have contributed to a growing unease about how this investigation has been managed. That unease extends to the relationship between the Pima County Sheriff's Office and the FBI, a relationship that was publicly described as tense in the early days of the case. FBI Director Kash Patel stated publicly that his agency was kept out of the investigation for the first 4 days following Nancy's disappearance. There were also reports that the DNA evidence was sent to a private laboratory in Florida that Pima County regularly uses, rather than to the FBI's facilities at Quantico, which are among the most sophisticated forensic labs in the world. A Pima County supervisor named Dr. Hines publicly stated that he believed the Nancy Guthrie investigation had already cost the county approximately $1 million and that allowing the FBI to handle the DNA and broader investigation from the beginning would not only have produced better results but would have saved the county significant resources. Sheriff Nanos disputed the narrative of tension, saying in his People magazine interview that the FBI was with his office from day one and that a working relationship always existed. He also pushed back against claims that FBI Director Patel's public remarks were fully accurate. But the facts on public record, including Director Patel's own statements, tell a more complicated story than the sheriff's version. What does appear to be true, based on statements from sources close to the investigation, is that a joint task force has since been formed and that cooperation between the two agencies has improved. But there is something else worth noting. Despite the sheriff's insistence that his office is in charge, it is now the FBI, not the sheriff, that is speaking directly to the Guthrie family. That single detail speaks volumes about where the real operational weight of this investigation currently sits. Law enforcement experts with decades of experience in missing persons and criminal investigations have noted that it is highly unusual for the originating agency to step back from family communication entirely. If there is a reason the FBI has taken over that role, it has not been publicly explained. And the absence of an explanation is itself a form of information. 104 days. No suspect. No confirmed leads. A DNA profile that has not yet been matched. A family that is no longer speaking to the sheriff leading the investigation into their loved one's disappearance. And a cold case threshold that has now been named out loud for the first time. There is so much more to unpack about where this investigation stands, what the silences in this case might mean, and what happens next if the DNA evidence does not break the way investigators are hoping. If you want to follow every development in the Nancy Guthrie case as it happens, this is the place to be. Subscribe to the Crime Whisper right now, and make sure you hit the like button before you go. Your support keeps this investigation alive and keeps the pressure on for the answers this family deserves. We are not done with this story. Not even close. There is a principle in criminal investigation that experienced detectives come back to again and again. You always maintain contact with the victim's family. Not just because it is courteous, and not just because it is procedurally expected, but because at some point in the process of building a case, you are going to need them. You may need them to testify. You may need them to provide evidence. You may need them to corroborate a timeline or identify a detail that only someone close to the victim would know. The moment you lose that relationship, you lose something that cannot easily be recovered. Which makes what is happening in the Nancy Guthrie investigation all the more striking. The Pima County Sheriff's Office is still technically the agency of record in this case. That has not changed. But the sheriff is no longer speaking directly to Nancy Guthrie's family. And when you layer that reality on top of everything else that has emerged from this investigation, a picture begins to form that raises questions nobody has been willing to answer out loud. Let us start with the DNA, because that is where the investigation is currently resting its entire weight. Investigators recovered a hair strand from the scene. It is rootless, meaning extracting usable DNA from it is not straightforward. That strand was sent to Quantico, the FBI's forensic laboratory, and the work being done on it falls under a discipline called investigative genetic genealogy. This is not a rapid process. It involves constructing broader family trees from partial DNA profiles, cross-referencing those trees against databases, and slowly narrowing the field until a potential contributor can be identified. Cases that have used this method successfully include some of the most high-profile cold case breakthroughs in recent American history. The identification of the Golden State Killer relied on this technique. So did the resolution of the April Tinsley case in Indiana, where a young girl was murdered in the late 1980s and her killer taunted investigators for decades. When technology eventually caught up, the DNA led investigators to a brother, and from there to the actual perpetrator. These cases demonstrate that the method works. But they also demonstrate that it takes time, sometimes months, and that success is never guaranteed. Here is what makes the DNA evidence in this case more complicated than it might appear on the surface. A hair strand found at a crime scene does not come with a date and time stamp. There is no way to know with certainty when it was deposited or under what circumstances. Criminal investigators are trained to consider something called Locard's exchange principle, which holds that every contact between two objects or people leaves a trace. Touch DNA, the kind transferred through casual human contact, can travel in unexpected ways. A hair picked up on the outside of clothing during an ordinary interaction could theoretically be transferred to an entirely different location under completely different circumstances. What that means in practical terms is this. The person who committed this crime was captured on doorbell video wearing a full face covering ski mask, a jacket covering the entire body, and what appeared to be double gloves. Someone dressed with that level of deliberate concealment would be unlikely to leave hair through direct scalp contact with a surface inside the home. If a hair was present, it may have come from the exterior of the clothing, which means it could have been picked up anywhere at any time before the crime occurred. That does not make the DNA evidence worthless. It does mean that investigators and the public alike need to be careful about treating it as a definitive silver bullet. The investigation has seen that kind of premature certainty before. Gloves were discovered during the course of this case and generated significant media attention. Those gloves ultimately could not be tied to the crime scene and proved to be nothing of investigative value. The DNA may break this case wide open. It may also present a far more complicated picture than anyone is hoping for. The honest answer right now is that nobody outside the lab knows which of those outcomes is coming. What investigators can say with more confidence is what the surveillance footage shows and what conclusions can reasonably be drawn from it. The individual seen on the doorbell camera approached the property deliberately. He was not rushed. He stood outside long enough that had the camera been actively recording and uploading to the cloud, his presence would have been captured in full. He removed the camera. He covered vegetation in front of it. And then, according to the evidence, Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home. The blood found at the scene stopped at the curb. That detail matters enormously. The curb is precisely where a vehicle would need to be positioned to transfer a person from the interior of a property into a waiting car. The camera was removed before Nancy was brought outside. Law enforcement experts who have analyzed this case publicly have drawn a specific conclusion from that sequence of events. The individual captured on that footage was not primarily concerned about being identified by his face. He was wearing a mask. He knew his face was not going to be the problem. What he could not disguise was the vehicle. A vehicle can be tracked, traced, and matched to an owner in ways that a masked face cannot. Removing the camera before the vehicle was present was not an act of panic. It was a calculated decision made by someone who understood exactly what law enforcement would look for afterward. That level of deliberate planning is itself a significant piece of information about who investigators may be looking for. This was not impulsive behavior. The individual demonstrated what experienced investigators describe as sophisticated tradecraft. The approach, the concealment, the sequencing of the camera removal before the transport, all of it points to someone who had either done something like this before or had thought through the process carefully in advance. That is not the behavioral profile of a burglar who made a spontaneous decision to escalate when something went wrong. When you step back and look at the totality of the evidence available, the picture that emerges is not consistent with a burglary that turned into something else. A burglary is about theft. The mission is to enter, take property, and leave without confrontation. Kidnapping is about control. It requires planning for containment, for movement, for what happens after the initial act. Those are fundamentally different operations, driven by fundamentally different motivations and requiring fundamentally different preparation. The evidence at the scene, the blood stopping at the curb, the deliberate camera removal, the level of concealment worn by the individual on the footage, the time of night, Nancy's age and cardiac condition, all of these factors point in one direction. Experienced voices in law enforcement who have reviewed this case publicly have described it as a no-body homicide, meaning the physical indicators are consistent with a homicide even though a body has not been recovered. Whether this was a targeted abduction, meaning the individual knew who Nancy Guthrie was and who she was connected to, or whether she was targeted simply because of the neighborhood and the perceived opportunity, remains unknown. That question may only be answerable by the person who committed the offense. The reward in this case has climbed to over $1 million. That amount of money is significant by any measure. And yet it has not produced a credible tip that broke the case open. There are a few possible explanations for that. One is that the person responsible is not from the Tucson area, which means the people around them in their daily life would have no reason to connect them to a case they are following on the news in another city. Another possibility is that this was carried out by a single individual. In criminal investigations, there is an observed pattern that holds true consistently. Two people cannot keep a secret indefinitely. The more people involved in a crime, the greater the probability that someone eventually talks, whether out of guilt, fear, financial desperation, or the simple human inability to hold something that heavy alone. A single operator does not face that pressure in the same way. The footage that exists does not definitively rule out a second individual. But several elements of what was captured and what was observed at the scene are consistent with a single person acting alone. If that is what investigators are dealing with, the silence around this case becomes more understandable, even if it remains deeply unsatisfying. The thousands of surveillance videos being cataloged from intersections, ring cameras, businesses, and neighborhoods represent an enormous undertaking. The stated approach has been to organize vehicles by type and color so that when a suspect is identified, investigators can rapidly search backward through the footage to locate that vehicle in the relevant time window. There is logic to that approach. But some investigators with experience in cases of this complexity have suggested the process might be more productive if inverted. Rather than waiting for a suspect and then searching for the vehicle, the argument is that investigators should identify every vehicle that passed through the relevant area during the specific window of time when the crime occurred, and then work backward from those vehicles to find any that warrant closer examination. That window is relatively narrow. The last known signal from Nancy's pacemaker to her phone was recorded somewhere between approximately 2:12 and 2:28 in the morning. That time constraint, combined with geographic analysis of the possible exit routes from the area, creates a manageable subset of vehicles that could theoretically be isolated and examined. The individual on the doorbell camera had visible physical characteristics despite the concealment. Approximate height can be calculated based on measurements taken at the scene. Gender can be assessed. Build can be observed. These data points, cross-referenced against driver's license databases filtered by height and gender, combined with potential AI-assisted analysis, represent a labor-intensive but potentially viable investigative pathway. The challenge is significant. If the person responsible had no prior contact with law enforcement in the Tucson area, there may simply be no existing record to surface. Someone who travels to a location, commits a crime, and leaves without leaving fingerprints or DNA that can be matched to a known profile can be extraordinarily difficult to identify through conventional means alone. That is the edge investigators are currently standing on. The DNA is in the lab. The surveillance footage is being catalogued. The reward has not moved the needle. And the sheriff is no longer talking to the family. 104 days in, with no confirmed suspect and no solid leads on public record, the question that sits at the center of everything is simple. Is something happening behind the scenes that has not been disclosed, something significant enough to explain why the FBI has taken over communication with the Guthrie family entirely? Or is the silence a reflection of exactly what it appears to be, an investigation that is waiting, with genuine uncertainty, for science to deliver an answer that law enforcement alone has not been able to find? Neither answer is comfortable. Both deserve to be asked. Nancy Guthrie's family is living this in real time, without resolution, without closure, and now apparently without direct access to the man whose office is still officially responsible for finding her. Whatever frustration exists within that family is not only understandable. Given everything documented in this case, it is the most natural response imaginable. This story is not finished. The answers are still out there. And this channel is not walking away from it. If you have been following this case and you want to make sure you do not miss a single development, subscribe to the Crime Whisper right now. Hit that like button before you go. Every subscription and every like tells the algorithm that this story matters, and it helps this work reach more people who are asking the same questions. The Crime Whisper will keep following this case until there are answers. Nancy Guthrie's family deserves nothing less.